this next panel, so what are we talking about? It's always interesting to get this kind of the panel together to talk about the threat landscape, which a lot of panels have made reference to it, but not given it the kind of depth. So wait till you see who we have for this panel together. Starting off, we've got Evgueni Erchov, Senior Director of Research and Threat Intelligence at Cypfer. They've got a booth out there. A cyber intelligence officer for the U.S. Army Reserve, specializes in threat intelligence, real-time research, advanced defense strategies. These are the people in the trenches on the front lines. They're all about data recovery and incident response, which is becoming more and more important. He's also a serious amateur chef. And so if you want to watch him on YouTube, in addition to watching him help you with your IR, you can get some extra help there. You may not know that. And he's obviously the Liam Neeson in incident response. A particular set of skills. Okay, next up, David Newman. Again, the people that you see on these panels, they're such overachievers that it's almost difficult to listen to all their accolades, but it's always extraordinary. Look at DOJ's regular rep to the Assistant Secretary for CFIUS meetings, NSC meetings. He led the administration-wide initiatives involving emerging technology. He's a partner and co-chair of National Security and Crisis Management Practices at Morrison and Foerster. David Newman. What you may not know, because his bio is almost as long as the novel War and Peace, is that look at all these things that he was. Principal Deputy Assistant AG for National Security, Associate Deputy Attorney General, Director for Counterterrorism in the NSC in the White House, Counsel for Assistant Attorney General, Law Clerk to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. This is, again, someone who's incredibly unique in every way, no matter what he's done in life. And that really makes him the Jack Ryan of these all five of them. Just take your pick and put them all together. Okay, Lindsay Nickle. Here's what you probably know from Lindsay, Vice Chair of the Cyber Team at Constangy. Is that the way to pronounce it? Constangy. Okay. Okay, Constangy. With special experience in IR involving health insurance, portability, accountability, and HIPAA, of course, and other the high-tech acts. So she's really gotten involved in a lot of this health stuff. She made her bones. This is, again, people have different backgrounds. As a trial attorney in healthcare and financial regulatory matters for more than 15 years before shifting over to doing data response and cybersecurity, which happens. And that makes her, if you listen to her practice a lot, she's the Ally McNeil of incident response. You'll know what I mean when you listen to some of her TikTok videos and she talks about her career path. And that's another thing, again, is any of the lawyers up here, if you're looking for a mentor or someone to give you advice or you have a tough decision to make, it's important to talk to people like Lindsay because they really are very thoughtful about this kind of thing. Because this is an area where you've made your own way. You didn't walk out of law school and decide this is what I'm going to do. There's a big department. I'll just join. Thanks. Bye. All right, next up, Sam Rubin. Oh, Sam Rubin I've known since we worked together at Strasbourg. Senior VP of Consulting and Threat Intelligence at Palo Alto, leading their Unit 42. We've all heard of the Unit 42 group. A response-ready, specialized division at Palo Alto comprised of threat researchers, incident responders, and security consultants. Sam was, we worked together at Strasbourg, then he left there to help build and found Crypsis, and then Crypsis was bought by Palo Alto. His title does not reflect the fact that his expertise in cybersecurity risk management, digital forensics, and incident response is really as good as it gets. And the reason I know that is because when I was at Strasbourg, he was the go-to for all the best managing directors there in terms of wanting anything done, the best expert witness. I don't know how many expert times he's been an expert witness, but his skills are legendary. And he's really probably one of the most spectacularly successful forensic people you will meet. And that makes him the Mr. Spock of incident response. Young, old, and the one also from the parallel universe. Okay, finally, what you already know about our next one of my favorites, she's been with us since the beginning, since the very first, is Phyllis Sumner, the head of data privacy and security. And she is just incredible cybersecurity preparedness, emergency response, compliance, internal regulatory enforcement, whatever you want to know at King and Spalding about Phyllis, she's done everything. She's also the only panelist today. She's the chief privacy officer of her firm. But in addition, what you might not know is that she just won first place at the U.S. Dressage Finals in Lexington, Kentucky. Now, I don't know if you know about dressage, but it is the most incredible thing to watch. I happen to know this. There's questions in my family. And when she said, so law.com actually sat down with Phyllis and said, tell us about this. And she said in the interview, training and competing benefits me physically and mentally and enhances my ability to manage long work hours and focus on difficult legal issues. You gotta love that. Everything Phyllis has ever done in her life, she's excelled. And that makes her the Isabel Worth of incident response. Okay, everybody knows who that is, right? She is the queen of dressage. Isabel Worth holds the record for the most Olympic medals won by any equestrian athlete. And I'd love to see Phyllis in the Olympics someday on this, but she's as close as it gets with the kinds of championship that she wins. And if she had a theme song, it would be Toby Keith, Beer for My Horses, because when Phyllis wins a cyber matter, that's what the chorus of being in Spalding will sing. So there we go. Let's turn it over to this group and hear what they have to say.
Well, thank you, John. I knew I could count on you to embarrass me well. So we are going to transition now and talk about the threat landscape, which, wow, it continues to evolve. When I think about the many years that I've been in this space, it is quite a different game than it was when I started. And we have a lot to cover today because of all the different threat actors that are focusing on our organizations. And so we're going to start and talk about some of the national the security threats, but really those nation state actors that are focused on organizations. Then we'll transition and we'll really focus on the cyber criminals, not those associated with nation states. And we're also going to talk about some of the preparation and remediation steps organizations should think about as we are working through this incredibly challenging landscape. So let's start with some country spotlights, because we have to be thinking about the nation state activity and the targeting of our organizations. Let's start with China. And Sam, I'm going to turn to you first and give us a little bit of information on that. And I will say, just in following reports, that we're seeing an incredible uptick in focus by nation state actors from China. And one report says that China activity surged 150% across all sectors and represents the most active targeted intrusion threats today. So why don't you give us a little bit of threat intelligence there and your thoughts on how to manage that?
Sure. So this is an amazing room of probably some of the more experienced and sophisticated attorneys and professionals in the space. And there was a lot of discussion today about China. So I think we all know just that they are our number one adversary when it comes to advanced persistent threat in terms of what they're doing. In terms of the why, three main themes. One is the espionage, right, which is the Salt Typhoon telecom type attack. Number two is the IP angle, where everything from health and life sciences to IP, and we even helped a video game company where there was Chinese APT involved. And the third reason really is pre-positioning relating to geopolitical situation, whether it be Taiwan, trade situations with tariffs. And what we see there is pre-positioning inside our critical infrastructure to attack us if and when the need arises from an escalation perspective. Just to put a little bit of color around sort of the extent of escalation, as you mentioned. So in Unit 42, we track all of Palo Alto Network's telemetry. And we're one of the biggest cybersecurity companies in the world. We have millions of firewalls. We have net flow data. We have endpoint data. We have cloud data. And so really since about 2022, we're seeing this ramp up in the amount of infrastructure that Chinese APT is running. And so about 2-3 years ago, we were tracking about 500 different IP blocks. It's close to 2,000 now. Changes, weekly, daily, up and down. And we see that those IP blocks targeting over 55 different countries across the world, where we can see traffic going from those countries to known APT infrastructure. So really an escalation of tactics.
David, would you add on to that and give thoughts about what organizations should be thinking about?
Sure. So Sam did a great laydown. I think I agree with all of that. The 3 points I would just emphasize. One, the pre-positioning point, because as much as we've seen an uptick now, I think everyone is bracing for the possibility that if there's further escalation or a further geopolitical event, whether it's Taiwan or tariffs or something else, that a lot of the powder that they've kept dry over the years, they will start to use. And I think, again, as capable as they have been so far, so much of their capability has been about things that are not really above the surface yet, and we haven't seen the full impacts of what they're doing. Second, I did just want to highlight in my former job in the US government, which I left in January, there has been this intensive focus, I think, in specifically on data and large structured data sets that can be used to power some of their ambitions in AI. And I think what you can do with large structured data sets and AI and a sophisticated adversary like China's capabilities is truly terrifying. And it has been a major focus of US government regulation. And I think it has to be kind of front of mind for any company that has kind of a data-rich set that would be of interest to an adversary. And then just the third point I would make is I do think that the way in which China has now structured its state-sponsored and state-adjacent cyber campaign is worth noting, which is to say they have this ecosystem of kind of notionally private or kind of off-books companies and entities that do this work. And I think, at least from a US government perspective, it can sometimes be very difficult to discern whether this is a state-directed action or whether this is a company that's trying to go where the puck is and kind of get information or get access that they think can be leveraged later. So, I think all of that adds up to just an incredibly capable adversary and dynamic threat picture. And I will say, just given everything going on in the world right now, you may yet soon see a very different look to the China cyber threat than you've seen so far.
So we're going to transition to another significant threat, and that's Russia. And we also need to be thinking about how to protect against potential intrusions there. The Director of National Intelligence Annual Threat Assessment said that Russia will pose an enduring global cyber threat, even as it prioritizes its own cyber operations, against the Ukrainians. So they're viewed as really cyber disruptions as a foreign policy lever, but also they threaten individual organizations. So Evgueni, let me start with you, and you can provide some thoughts from a organizational perspective. What do companies need to be thinking about as a result of this threat?
I think, from perspective of Russia, it will continue to be a significant state-sponsored threat. But at the same time, I want to kind of shift the focus a little bit, because historically, Russian state-sponsored groups leverage cyber criminal organizations in Russia as a resource pool. Like in some cases, they were recruiting operators directly from there. Like in other cases, they would provide legal coverage for cyber criminals to basically allow them to conduct the cyber criminal operations. And in the same time, helping out the government APT organizations to conduct the operations. And over the course of the last 3 years, we observed a significant shift in the cyber criminal landscape, and it was like 3 significant waves that we've seen. And I call it the Great Migration. The inspiration came from the cartoon, like with ducks flying over from one location to another. But it's all started with the Ukraine-Russia war. So once the war started, a lot of people were displaced and left both Ukraine and Russia. If I remember correctly, more than 7 million people left Ukraine. Our thought process back then was okay, if you're a wealthy cyber criminal, you probably would not want to stick around. You would not want to do anything to deal with that war. You'll pick up your family and go. And that theory back then ended up being correct, because the first known arrest happened when a guy from Ukraine, operator of Raccoon Stealer, literally 3 days after the start of the war, jumped into his Porsche Cayenne with his wife and drove to Netherlands. Why Netherlands? I have no idea. I wouldn't ever drive there if I would be a cyber criminal. But then,
Don't give away all of our tricks in the beginning.
But then his wife snapped a picture and posted on the Instagram, and literally a couple of weeks later, he was picked up by a local law enforcement over there. So since then, at least more than 30, at least what's public known, more than 30 high-value target cyber criminals were picked up all over Europe and some even in the US. Like the funny story that like one of the guy was indicted by Department of Justice since 2014, thought it was a good idea to go to Germany. And the same thing happened to him. His wife snapped a picture on Instagram, and a few weeks later he was picked up. So I guess the moral of the story here, if you're a cyber criminal, just take away phone from your spouse because it's not going to end well. So the second wave started at the fall of 2022 when Russia announced mobilization, and every male under 55 potentially could be drafted and go into war. At the same time, some of the local countries were starting to get bothered by all the cyber criminals moving into their country and started working more closely with US law enforcement and conducting operations against them. So those kind of like locations became like less friendly for cyber criminals. And the last nail in the coffin happened, it started in the fall of the last year when Russia, that I thought I would never see ever, conducted several arrests of cyber criminals inside of Russia. And Russia used to be a safe haven for cyber criminals before, as long as you pay your cut, and like you can get away pretty much with anything as long as you don't target organizations like within the Russia. But since then, so like several of them got real life sentences. The operator of Hydro Market, which is similar to Alphabet, got life in prison. The guy that was wanted by FBI was picked up in Kaliningrad, and the list goes on. So it like sent like shockwaves within the cyber criminal community, and like, more people started to leave. And now, since like most of the local countries are already working, and Europe already working very closely, like with U.S. Law enforcement, my theory is that majority of those cyber criminals are actually moving to South America. Like if you would Google visa requirements for Russian citizens, like South America, except for two tiny countries, like completely wide open. And I promise I'm almost done, but one of my predictions is that I wouldn't be surprised that eventually we'll see some of those groups working with cartels directly. It's a bit of a misconception that cartels are only dealing with drugs, laundering money, but that's not true. Like those are very well organized business organizations. They're involved in other like type of like operations as well. They provide internet service. They have like farms. They conduct like gold mining operations. And one little unknown fact is that more than 90% of producers of avocados in Mexico are controlled by cartels.
Let's move then from cartels to a different area of the world for a minute and just talk about North Korea, because that is another important area to be focused on because they are specifically targeting organizations. So I do want to address that for a moment. They are known for some ransomware attacks, but they also have some unique ways of gaining access to organizations. And it was mentioned earlier, but David, why don't you just talk a little bit about the IT worker schemes that we're seeing that really provide opportunities to get access to organizations?
Sure, absolutely, and I will never not be able to eat guacamole again, by the way, with the same guilt-free mentality. But so what we have seen from the North Korean regime, including in my time in government, was that regime is increasingly funding itself through its malicious cyber program, and in particular through crypto heists, and as you mentioned, through their DPRK IT worker scams. The way those scams typically operate is they have kind of a farm, like a factory floor with workers who purport to be Western IT workers and use various job sites and social networking sites to get interviews and access to legitimate jobs in Western companies. In the first instance, the goal of those schemes, as I think folks here know, because I know it's a very sophisticated group, is just to earn revenue, because obviously what you can earn as a Western IT worker dramatically eclipses what you can earn in the DPRK, and then they remit most of that revenue back to the North Korean government. But they also, I think we have seen even a more pernicious wave where at certain times there can also be moments of opportunity where they compromise the networks and systems of the companies that they penetrate, either because it's just too good an opportunity to pass up, or because they think that their access has been compromised. And so from a company takeaway perspective, and when I was in government, we did a lot of work with FBI and DOJ on this, there's just a tremendous amount of risk for you if you are not doing the right screening and vetting of your IT workers, because these schemes are surprisingly sophisticated and work well. And we actually, I won't name the agency, but we even at DOJ had an instance where one of our sister agencies fell victim to this scheme and hired IT workers, which was a very dark moment for the US government. So I think screening IT workers, coming up with practical ways to confirm access, being very alert to the pervasiveness of this are all critically important. I would also say that in the current environment, in which there is obviously a very heightened focus in general on ensuring that you are hiring a legal workforce and complying with all applicable immigration laws, I think there's a doubly good reason not to find yourself compromised in such a way in which you have employed workers in the DPRK. And then the last thing I will just say is, when you look at the revenue that North Korea has that is attributable to this activity, it is probably the single greatest opportunity to downscale their ambitions from everything from their nuclear program to their broader kind of malign military agenda, is to try to reduce that revenue. So that's why that's been such a focus of the US government, because unlike China and even Russia, the North Korean economy is now basically being propped up by this type of cyber activity, and anything that can be done to reduce it is going to have a significant effect on abating the broader risk that they continue to pose given all of their malign activities.
So Lindsay, let me turn to you for a minute, because much of the preparation and remediation of risk involves a good insider threat program. Do you have thoughts about advice to organizations? Because there are lots of red flags that come up in these contexts, and organizations should be looking for them and addressing them.
So one of the things that happens when you sit in a room of people like all of we are, I mean, these are experts. These are people that we're exposed daily to different types of threats and different types of scenarios. But when you're doing a discussion of the threat landscape, and when you start thinking about nation state actors or nation backed actors or that type of activity, one of the things that comes from my perspective, because I do not have the street cred that these gentlemen have, what I have is the in the trenches experience. The number of times that I have had a client say, it won't happen to us. We're not a target. We don't have anything they want. That is a fallacy, because anyone is a target. And the clients that I have had that have experienced, we just figured out we hired someone from North Korea. I had a case last year. We called the guy Fake Nathan. I don't actually know his name, but he had stolen an identity and had gotten hired at a company using the fake identity. And this company had no idea there were red flags to look for. And as a result, we ended up doing a large-scale investigation to figure out where he had gone, what he had looked at, data he had exfiltrated. I remember listening to my client say, I just had no idea. He was really good at his job. Well, great. Just because he's North Korean doesn't mean he's bad at his job. He just has other things he's trying to do as well. And so the preparation standpoint of this is not just tools. It's not just what's our firewall look like, what does our EDR tool look like, what does our anti-malware or antivirus look like, who's the CISO, who's the CIO. It's about, you have to know what the threats are, and you have to know that just because you aren't critical infrastructure or a large organization doesn't mean that you're not a target of this type of activity. It's all opportunistic, and it all presents a challenge. And the more education we can give about resources to help educate, how do you keep from hiring a North Korean? There are actually tips. Make them go outside on camera. See if that works. Ask the hard questions. If they fight back against you, against background checking or information that you need to verify, we need to equip our clients with more than just, hey, you need an EDR tool and a good firewall. We need to equip them with things that we in this room think are common sense, but a lot of our clients have never thought of because they don't believe they're in the crosshairs.
So great tips, and obviously a takeaway is that in reducing risk with respect to certain nation state actors is having a really strong insider risk program. And we're not going to really spend time on Iran other than to note that that's another country that is really up and coming and in this territory, and has also been recognized by the Director of National Intelligence as growing expertise and willingness to conduct very aggressive campaigns. I do want to segue, though, to talk about cyber criminals, because it wouldn't be right to talk about the threatscape without addressing that, because they, of course, have the majority of the attacks against organizations. The nation state actors are out there, but the numbers really support that. It's organized crime and gangs that are, and we're seeing the change here where there are many new gangs that are starting to develop. You heard earlier in the day conversation around it's hard now to know exactly who you're dealing with. They're changing rapidly. So, let me start, Sam, with you and talk a little bit about the shift of gangs and what you're seeing from a threat intelligence and what companies, again, focusing on what they should be prepared to deal with.
Yeah, there's been a lot of great discussion today about some of this sophisticated, financially motivated cybercrime. I think what I'd like to touch on is what we're calling this third wave of extortion attacks. The first wave was encryption, right? We're going to lock up a file system and demand payment. Companies got better at backups and other resilient mechanisms, so that lost its sting. Wave 2 is data theft, which is still happening, of course, but we're even becoming a little bit desensitized to that as companies have had their data breach. And how many letters have you all gotten in the mail in the last 6 months? I think I've had 4 or 5. So the third wave that we're seeing here is this intentional operational disruption, where they can bring a company to its knees because if they're in healthcare, they can't deliver patient care. If they're in a SaaS business, they can't reach their customers, and it's costing millions of dollars, or it's putting patient lives in jeopardy. And that is enabling them to get the leverage, to get the payment, to make the pain stop. So that's the trend that we're seeing in some of these big attacks. We're responding to one right now. The threat actors were in there. They found the production systems and destroyed over 250 ESXi servers running the production environment, and that was just the beginning. So this is the trend that we're keeping our eye on.
Evgueni, what are you seeing in the shift and change with some of the cyber criminals?
So we definitely have seen, because of the migration, because of successful law enforcement operations, we definitely see groups getting smaller, because at this point it's too dangerous to stay big and too noisy, because you'll get attention from FBI and international law enforcement. Kind of the good news there is that I think the split up and rebranding is kind of got to a certain stable level. And since the beginning of this year, the average number of active groups stays about the same. 1 or 2 of them can change name every once in a while, but at least number of groups stays about the same. And I think one thing that I wanted to mention is that Lindsay and I were discussing it a couple of weeks ago at another conference, is that potential physical violence as an additional layer of threat. And Lindsay, if you want to share some of the horror stories from your clients.
Yeah, so physical threats as another layer of extortion have been around for a while, and it's not the kind of thing that we see in every single incident. We'll see phone calls, harassment techniques, things that are designed to disrupt the business, to make it hard for them to operate, or to make it difficult for executive levels to answer questions about what incident may be happening. But we are starting to see and hear about some additional trends of physical violence. And I've had at least one client that was threatened with physical violence. And I remember having a discussion with him about, these people aren't here. He was in the United States, and I said, nobody's going to come and knock on your door. I understand that you're scared. You're right to be scared. Being physically threatened by anyone is a frightening thing. And in that particular case, law enforcement came back to us 2.5 years later. That's how long ago this happened. 2.5 years later, they came back and said they had indicted someone and asked for cooperation, and he refused because he was still afraid. So physical threats have teeth. Add to it, and this mortifies me, violence as a service. So all of us in this room deal with ransomware as a service. We know what that is. But when you make violence a service and now the physical threats become real, and I can't tell my clients anymore, hey, this person's in Russia, or this person's in China, or Iran, or North Korea. If I have to tell my client this physical threat could be real, it changes everything. It changes all of the things that we as an industry have worked toward to try to shut down the mindset behind ransom payments. When AI engines can go through social media and pull your CFO's wife's name, his children's names, the school they go to, the club sports they participate in, they can get all of that information in an instant. And now the threats actually become real. Earlier this year, we had a case that my team handled that involved a threat to burn a house down. And that changes the mood.
So we're seeing these dynamics shift as organizations are more sophisticated. They have better capabilities of monitoring and detecting activity. Ransomware, the capability of shutting that down quicker. So these threat actors are coming up with other ways to extract pain on organizations, which goes hand in hand with what Lindsay's discussing. But there are a variety of harassment tactics, and in fact, they are hiring people in the U.S. to assist. And oftentimes, unfortunately, they are young people who believe that this is an opportunity to make significant money. And that involves really ugly harassment of individuals, families. We have had scenarios where children in college directly receive text messages from threat actors. We're seeing an uptick in swatting, where, and it's an easy thing for the threat actor to do. They get all the information they need between sometimes on the corporate websites about the leaders, social media, dark web, and all of a sudden they can actually call a police station and pretend that there is some murder or domestic dispute or something at a home, and the SWAT team goes out to that house. Very, very scary, very real if that family is not expecting it. And that there's an uptick on that because they're coming up with ways to get an organization's attention. We've had many times where an organization will begin the conversation with, there's no way we're engaging with these threat actors, there's no way we're paying a ransom, and then they're dealing with these threats and they're like, oh, wow, this is a very different scenario. I think we need to engage to stop this and to make some hard decisions about how to handle it. So that's part of the shift that is occurring now with these threat actors, and it is quite scary. And we have to prepare our clients for that, including all the way up to the board, because they will go to the executives and they will go directly to the board. And it's another reason to make sure that the board is alerted to an incident that involves threat actors that may have that tendency. Let's talk about artificial intelligence. There was a touch on that at the end of one of the other presentations, but I'd like for you all to focus on this as really how threat actors are using it to make it easier to take advantage of individuals and organizations. So David, you want to start us with that?
Sure. I mean, artificial intelligence has really shortened the distance, I think, between a lot of threat actors and the US public. It just makes, at the most basic level, it allows them to make much more credible seeming, low cost, at scale efforts to send, credible seeming messages. I think before, the kind of limited language capability in a lot of regions that are havens for cybercrime was one of the big limiters. And now you're seeing just much more credible messages. Obviously, there are much higher end technical applications that I'm sure others on this stage can better understand, that also allows AI to do what Lindsay was mentioning, which is to find very quickly the kind of key pressure points and core information that they're looking for, and also allows them to find vulnerabilities and to think much more innovatively about how to kind of find the exploits that they need. So whether you're talking about the kind of lowest end cyber criminal who's using it just to write credible seeming messages, or the highest end organizations that are using it in the most sophisticated ways, I do think it's dramatically changed the kind of cost structure and the workforce availability for these groups, and it has changed the nature of the threat.
Lindsay, anything to add on that?
So one of the things I think is worth mentioning is that if you were to speak to any business out there about, gosh, what is the greatest AI threat? What you're going to get back most likely is their fear of like the deep fake video. Am I going to be tricked by the deep fake video that looks like it's my boss? Are they going to talk me into transferring money when I otherwise shouldn't? That's a real threat. But in the trenches, with what we're actually seeing on a day-to-day basis, that's a little bit of an outlier. It's something everybody needs to be aware of, because I think it will continue to increase, the usage will increase over time. But the real
and it has
effect.
been successful.
Yes, it has been successful.
And if I could just add,
Yeah.
so we do see it most often is with the North Korean IT worker
Okay.
scheme. They're
Yes.
using video deepfakes to get for the job interview. But
Yeah, and so it does happen and it does exist, and I think it's what most organizations are most afraid of. They should be afraid of it. It's not a non-existent threat, but what is having the most significant impact on the day-to-day incidents that come into our team, and what we respond to are the sophisticated phishing threats. It's you can put together, not me, I can't. Someone on the dark web, I'm not going to the dark web, someone can put together a sophisticated phishing campaign in 10 or 15 minutes, if that long. And the misspellings are gone, the grammatical errors are gone, the suspicious pictures are gone. They look so real and are so quick to put together. The volume of phishing has gone up, and the ability to socially engineer through that has gone up in such a way that it's absolutely dramatic. And so even organizations that have very sophisticated phishing training and the buttons that people are supposed to push, you can fool you can fool the most well-trained people because they have greater, I'm not going to call it skill because that it's not skill. It's they're letting the AI engine think for them and create more volume. So there's more volume that we have to deal with.
So we have to live in a world of paranoia at this point and question everything. Sam, what are some of the controls, proactive steps organizations should be thinking about in order to, be prepared for these types of threats?
yeah, so shifting from what we should be scared of to what we should do about it
Yes.
here. So if we look across all the IR we do, and Unit 42 did about 500 or so large incidents last year, and we look at what are the common contributing factors, what's consistent across these three themes jump out. The first one is that complexity leads to large breaches, where you have big enterprises with a mismatch of different IT controls, different business units, and things they can't see the signal for the noise, right? And so when we come in and do the forensics and figure out what happened, I think we did some research, and about 75% of the time, it's in the logs. Like, we're able to recreate what happened, but the company can't operationalize it. So removing complexity, operating in a way where you can use the data and telemetry that you have in an effective way, that's number one. Number two is the visibility. Enterprises have blind spots. The parts of their network that are covered, EDR, XDR that's not deployed in some places, cloud isn't part of what the SOC is covering, and a large portion of breaches come from unmanaged devices. And so getting your security controls around all of it is number two. And the number three way is over-permissioning or too much trust in environments. We did some research across cloud environments, and we found over 90% of accounts and applications had more privilege afforded to them than they needed. So imagine if you're a threat actor and you land in a cloud environment, you can do whatever you want, go wherever you want, use those applications, or use the control plane to spin up more infrastructure to carry on your attack. So those are the three things to get your arms around.
Great, and those become critical in particular as threat actors are really taking advantage of acquiring credentials to access environments. So if you get, that through that authentication process and you're in, you better hope that you've employed some of the controls that Sam talked about. Do you have anything to add to that?
One thing I want to mention is that we constantly talk about the good backups. Make sure you have multi-factor enabled. Like a lot of companies supposed to have it, but as we see every day, there's still tons of companies out there that only either partially employed some of those almost standard recommendations. Obviously, you cannot have the best in the world cybersecurity solution because it can be really expensive and not affordable for your company. But there's a Russian saying in order to survive, you just have to be faster than an average bear. And the same true for our industry, because cyber criminals spend time and money on trying to breach different organizations. Even by elevating overall your cybersecurity posture, you significantly reduce chances of being a victim of one of those attacks.
So let's take a couple of minutes and just talk about managing through actually paying these threat actors, because it's a significant decision, first of all, as to whether to engage. But as you've seen, there are lots of ways that the threat actors are kind of forcing organizations to engage, not just to understand the data that they took, but to stop the harassment campaigns that they are now launching against organizations. And then there's a decision as to whether to pay. This segues with the nation state actors, because there are significant sanctions issues, even with the North Korean IT workers. Once you find out that you're actually paying someone who may be supporting these nation state actors, now you are potentially in sanctioned territory. So David, why don't you talk a little bit about some of the steps that organizations should think about now that we're in this potential payment territory?
Well, first of all, as I'm sure many of you do, we do cyber tabletops with executive teams and leadership teams, and most of them begin with the management team saying they would never pay. And then once you get about 2 steps into a 10-step exercise, they've all agreed that there are circumstances where they would pay. So I think a lot of people aren't prepared for that moment, because they just take the position we wouldn't pay, when that's not the reality, because I think enterprises are very good. In terms of payment, I think, Phyllis, your point is really the right one, which is there are obviously lots of legal risks associated with making these payments, and reputational risks. At a minimum, what we often advise clients, and what I think is generally very good practice, is even if you're otherwise not sure whether to report an incident to the government, if you are contemplating making a payment, that is often a very good predicate to review whether you should be reaching out to the government. Because I think, as a risk-based matter, if you have reached out to the FBI, if you've conveyed to them that you believe you're in a circumstance where you have to make a payment, and if you haven't been waived off of making that payment and warned specifically about the sanctions risk, for example, then that is at least something that you can have with you if you have to then defend your decision. And the other thing is to let the experts, such as the folks on this stage, both help you figure out how to make the payment, but also look for any of the indications that the actors you're paying might be North Korean or Russian or Iranian, who are all very, very possibly sanctioned. And I think you may see, because of some of the trends we've seen, increasing overlap between Chinese cyber actors and potentially an expansion of either US sanctions or workings together between those groups and other sanctioned entities. So I think the risk of making those payments is only going to go up. And I think that the reasons to reach out to law enforcement beforehand is only more prudent.
And we are seeing, of course, an increase in activity. I think one of the panels talked about the IC3 reports, and in just looking at those reports, and we know that many of these events are not being reported to IC3, so you have to recognize that when you look at the stats. But in 2024, they'd received 880,000 complaints with potential losses exceeding 12.5 billion. Compare that to 2020, when the reported losses were 4.2 billion. That's quite an increase. So I think the takeaway here is the horizon in many ways is getting trickier. The risks to organizations stay very high. So you need to be prepared to respond, and you've heard lots of panels today talk about that as well, so that we can immediately begin to remediate the risks that are posed for the organizations. So I think with that, we have hit our time, and we thank you very much.